Well, hey, New City, thanks for joining us. We did the Q&A questions for our first series in our Doctrine and Deed series, and we got a good number of questions. And so we're just going to answer these. This is on wherever you're listening to this, either on our New City podcast feed, where you get podcasts. It's also on our YouTube channel, so you can catch it at both places. We're just going to go one by one to these questions. How we're going to do this is we're trying to keep like the live Q&A vibe. So we've seen these questions, but these are kind of just like off-the-cuff answers, not spending like 3 hours trying to research. It's like, hey, if we had done a live Q&A right after the service, how would we answer it? That's kind of this approach. And so now you texted in questions, and so we'll keep doing this throughout the series for each week. If people text in questions, this one is on what is the Bible? And so let's get into it.
Yeah, because I just woke up, so not really, but that's how live stuff goes. People just wake up. Okay. Right. All right, so one of our first questions here is, how should we approach different Bible translations? It seems like there are many translations that now exist, should be considered commentaries rather than raw scripture. So like, just talk about the translations.
Yeah, excuse me. So there's two ends of the spectrum. One end's kind of like more thought for thought, and one end's more kind of word for word, so more literal or kind of more paraphrase. Basically what you have there is when you're translating from the Hebrew or the Greek into English, you have to pick a method of translation. A more literal translation is, here's the most precise, although sometimes you still have to pick because it can be multiple, most precise English word for this Greek word. The problem is the most precise English word sometimes can lead to a more wooden reading translation, or maybe the more precise English word is a word that's not used very often, so it like comes across as like harsh or like it's not very culturally relevant. Thought for thought is not so much literal, but it tries to capture the essence. So this is a really bad example I like to give. Let's say the literal verse, and this is not a verse, was like, John lit the candle to light up the room. You know, maybe that's not the best one because we understand candles. But like a more like thought for thought was John turned on the lights when he walked into his room. But that one's not too helpful because we do candles, but that's that sort of thing. But what's happening here is kind of the commentaries. I would say this, all translations in some way are commentaries, because sometimes like you have to pick a word, and whenever you go from one language to another, sometimes you need a couple of words in one language to convey the meaning, but you can't do that when you're trying to pick a word. So on one end of this, like the Message people are familiar with, that is, I would say, is a paraphrase or a commentary, because and I think it's, I don't know, no problem reading the Message, but he really is kind of like interpreting as he is translating some of these words to kind of gain the essence. Like that's not actually what it says, but that is the thought. And so that's what can happen is, one thing is kind of a more wooden translation, more thought for thought. I think most of the general translations would fall into translations. I wouldn't call most of them commentaries, although I understand what you're saying. But like, for example, I would say this, and I know we got a lot of questions to get to, so keep going. But we'll see how long this goes. Like, I wouldn't preach from the Message, because to me that's more of a paraphrase, kind of like a commentary-ish, if you will. But I think a lot of the normal ones, NIV, ESV, CSB, NSAB, NET, I mean, there's one of the questions we'll see like which one we like more, but like those are all translations, just kind of like what is the methodology in that translation that the translators are using.
I believe Eugene Peterson, who did the Message, the paraphrase, he got a bad rap at first because like they did look at it as like a literal translation, or he never claimed for it to be. So I think it's been helpful for me when I'm preparing and studying. I will consult the Message because I'm like, man, I just cannot wrap my brain around this terminology because we are so far removed from the first century. And it's like, oh, okay, I was either the right direction or that makes sense. You know, but it's never something to really dive deep into it. It definitely is supplementary.
Yeah, and I would say this too. So let me give you an example. Like the ESV or the KJVs, these are more word for word literal translations. And so if you would read some passage in the Old Testament, it'll talk about how people were whoring after other gods. Now that might be, I'm not sure what the Hebrew word they're translating there, but that's probably a very appropriate literal translation of the Hebrew word. Yeah. However, in our 2024 modern context, and this is not about changing the Bible, but this is about reading it how they would have understood it. Yeah. Saying somebody is whoring after something is not like a typical everyday vernacular usage. Yep. And so some translations, instead of saying whoring, might say prostituting, or they might say something completely different. And it's not because like they're trying to change what the Bible says. They're trying to capture how it was understood in this original language. And so that's where some of that comes in. And more thought for thought would kind of give a different word. And a more literal is like, here's what it says, even if it's not a word that people necessarily use in modern language today, as much as they would have maybe 300 or 400 years ago.
Language definitely shifts. There's nothing we can really do
Correct.
with that. Language, etymology, all that kind of stuff. Is that no, not etymology. Anyway, etymology. That's it. So the follow-up question is like, which one of your favorite translations?
So, what translation you like the best? My recommendation is the one that you read. Even if that includes the message, man, just read it. I'm more of a more on the literal side of things. I like those better. My favorite is the one that we use at New City. Go figure, is the CSB. The CSB is so if you want to Google, like, you can just Google like translation thought for thought. If you just kind of Google, like, you can get like a spectrum of where all the translations fall on like the translation spectrum. If you just kind of Google thought for word Bible translations, there's lots of graphics, that sort of thing. The CSB is more on the literal side, but not as far as like the ESV, that sort of thing. The reason I like the CSB is it tries to keep some of the more word for word translations, but it'll substitute out words like whoring, for example. And I didn't look up a specific example of like taking the KJV and the CSB, but like that's just not a language that anybody listening to this podcast. I mean, we don't use that language. Like we don't talk about something whoring after, like we just don't.
Nope.
And so it'll like keep everything else the same. It'll change one word. So it's more on the word for word side, but it's not as literal as like the ESV, KJV, that sort of thing. I will just say this: I think the KJV is a very bad translation for us to read. I know there's like KJV only. We won't get into that. The thing is, it's a very literal translation. It was also written like 400 or 500 years ago by English we don't speak. So like. The original New Testament, for example, was in Koine Greek, was the everyday language of the average person in that time. The KJV, even when it was written, was like high Victorian language. It wasn't like a modern common language. And so when you're reading a book that's using all these words that like are hard to understand and you don't use, like that's not how the New Testament was read when it first came out. And also, I would just say it's not a great translation because like the further along we've gotten, the last 400, 500 years, we've found more manuscripts, and so you can really hone down and be even more accurate. And there are some things in the KJV that aren't as accurate as others because we've just gotten better things for it. So I like the CSB, but I would just say pick something and read it.
Yeah, no, I'll agree with you. I actually don't really have a preference. It's weird because when I went to school, like I was already reading different ones. So if you told me what one is that, what did you just read from? I don't know. I just know that doesn't sound like heresy. So I'm like, we're good, you know. So I don't really have a favorite. I would say ESV is what I've usually read, which I've said it's more of a poetic or smoother read, and Dylan's like, no, it's not. But it might just be because I'm just so used to like the cadence of it.
Yeah, well, I mean,
not you particularly, but just
I mean, it's a more literal thing, but it's not like the KJV. It's like with modern English.
Yeah.
The KJV is like literal, not as great a translation,
Not
and
modern
it's
English.
in English that's like 500 years old.
Yeah. Cool.
And so yeah.
All right. So along with different translations of the Bible, we've got this passage, John 7:53 through 8:11. A lot of our modern Bibles include this when early manuscripts don't, as the question goes. So let's address that, and then referring to that, what do you think Jesus wrote in the ground?
Right.
So
So-
I'll maybe share more about
John
that.
7:53 through 8:11 is the story of the woman caught in adultery. Where I won't read it just for time's sake, but like they bring this, they don't have the man, even though they're both doing this thing. They just bring the woman out. They want to stone her, and Jesus is like, the one without sin should cast the first stone. Eventually, they all drop their stones. Well, before that, Jesus also writes something in the ground, and they walk away. Now, that's actually not in, and you'll see in your Bible translations, it is not in the earliest manuscripts that we have. So it will say like, not in the earliest manuscripts, which probably means it was not in the original. Now, this doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I do think it's helpful to know like it's not in the original. I'm comfortable preaching this text because I am persuaded that it did actually happen for various reasons. Why it's not in the original, I'm not sure, but it was adopted early on, and it wasn't rejected. And because there are so many early manuscripts that do have it, that's where some scholars will say like, well, if this didn't happen, I think they would have like taken it out, and they didn't. So is this the most early ones don't have it? Now, I don't have it again without doing all this research. I'm not sure when it got first introduced. Again, we don't have like the oldest, and so from the ones that we have, I'm not sure the history behind when it got introduced and why they ended up leaving it. But I think the reason it's in there is because enough of the early ones that we do have, even though it's not the earliest ones that we have, included it. So that's why it's in there. I think it's because maybe this scholarly consensus is like it probably did happen even if it wasn't in the original. Now, the question in John 8:6, what do you think Jesus wrote in the ground? We have no idea.
Yeah.
I preached
He did.
this, or a part of this from some sermon this past year.
Yeah.
And I heard one, I don't know. Some people say maybe the sins of the people who were standing around. I think it's kind of funny. I have no idea, but I saw somebody explain it this way, so I think it's kind of funny. Like, imagine Jesus like writing the list of the women that some of these men had slept with. I should say, not funny. The way I kind of did it was kind of funny. I was like, Sarah, and I looked, and Jesus like looks at one guy, like Ashley, and then looks at another guy. And it's like, you're stoning this woman for something that you did. Especially in the first century culture, like, marriage was about legacy and family, particularly for men. It wasn't about romance. And so men were, now in the Jewish tradition, you weren't supposed to. But at the culture at large was like, men can go outside their marriage and sleep with whoever they want. Women are not allowed to. And so there's a very high degree that many of these men who were about to stone this woman perhaps might have slept with other women as well. So we don't know what Jesus actually wrote in the sand. But I like the idea of either writing some of their sins or maybe writing some names of women. It's like, you're about to stone this woman for something that you've done. But we don't know.
Yeah, because it's one of those things where it's like, if he just says, "You who without sin cast the first stone," and they're just thinking that Jesus is not God, so they're thinking, this guy doesn't know what I've done.
Right.
But then he starts writing what they've done, then it's like, oh, he knows. I gotta go. There's evidence now. So, I mean, I like it, but it definitely is speculation. But, so. All right, so next question we have here is, so the Bible Project. You love the Bible Project.
I do.
Bible Project, awesome. Dylan listens to it a lot more than I do, but their stuff is just solid. A lot of awesome research. They've talked about the book of Joshua. Was often written in hyperbole, with inflated numbers and facts given the ancient customs of describing the winners and conquerors in battle. This contrasts with the exact detail given in the New Testament. How do you reconcile the Bible's reliability in light of this historical custom?
So, really great question. They're talking about the battle conquests in the book of Joshua, and there's like lots of numbers, like high numbers. And the question is, well, should we, like, if they weren't precise in their numbering, like, should we throw that out? I mean, it seems like the New Testament, the examples I gave yesterday, were like pretty precise. I have a couple thoughts. One, I think, as this person acutely pointed out, it's helpful to think through how would the original audience have understood what was being written. Because again, the Bible was not written to us. It was written for us, but it wasn't written to us. It was written to the original audience. In the ancient world, there was a common practice of inflating, yes, but also rounding numbers. So again, without like doing a bunch of study in Joshua, and I'm a big fan of the Bible Project, and so I'm not exactly sure how they worded all this, but it was common practice to like round out numbers. So not like in today's day and age, we might say like 532 people died, because like that's just in the ancient culture you wouldn't do that, but it was understood.
Yeah.
Like they wouldn't be like, oh, I need precise, like they wouldn't be reading Joshua in the ancient world assuming precise numbers. Now it doesn't mean that like they should be wildly inaccurate, but like they would, it's like we have to understand their assumption with the text.
Well, the purpose of why they were there.
So I would say that. The second thing is, so I do think part of it is the round numbers, maybe making it a little bit smaller to show certain things. That was just a common practice in the ancient world, which is different than ours. I'm not excusing it, but I'm just saying it's helpful to know. Other thing I would say is, again, I don't know Joshua specific, but there is debate about the numbers in the Exodus story and going to the Promised Land. I will, if don't throw stones at me. Without sin, don't throw stones. It is. I like to use the word persuaded, because a lot of this stuff, man, we're not there. We don't know for sure. I am personally persuaded in my current understanding of the scriptures that when you read the Exodus story and into the Promised Land, our English translations talk about like 100,000, like there was 600,000 men of fighting age, or there was like 1.2 million people who left Egypt. There is two different ways to understand the counting in the ancient Hebrew, and it is kind of ambiguous. That it could be like 1.2 million, or it could be like in the tens of thousands. So there's like, they're both legitimate understandings. I am persuaded that it wasn't, and I don't know these numbers off the top of my head because again, I didn't want to spend a lot of time on it. There were not 1.2 million Israelites who were enslaved in Egypt and were set free. For a lot of reasons, historically, that sort of thing. Like if you were like a million people in number and you're like walking through like traveling to the Promised Land, like there is no country that could stop you.
Yeah.
Because in the ancient world, I mean, most cities are like 150 people, like, whatever. So it's like, I think that's a better understanding. So a part of this is, with our English translations, I know this might like be kind of shocking for some people, and I get that, but we should wrestle with the Bible. I think we've got a question about that too. I am persuaded that like some of these numbers weren't actually that big. It's just how we have interpreted reading these numbers, and you could do it multiple ways. So I don't, again, without looking at Joshua, I would say some of the inflated numbers are, I would say, not inflated purposefully. And then some of them could be like, hey, there might have been 5,000 and they might have said 10,000. I don't know, for example. But it was kind of like the common practice. And that would not be the common practice today. That wouldn't be the common practice in the first century. Like if Jesus fed the 5,000 and we saw like, hey, sit down in groups of 50s to 100s, whatever, and it was really like 20,000, I think the first century would be like, I mean, the first century was also not as precise as we are, but they would be like, that's like not what happened.
Yeah.
So there's a lot that you can say that. So how do you reconcile the Bible's reliability in light of this historical custom? We have to read the context in which they understood it. There could be more said there, but those are some quick thoughts.
Yeah, I would say, like, to answer the question directly, I don't think there is much to reconcile. And what I mean by that is, like, usually when somebody reconciles, like, one party, there is one that's having to not apologize, but, like, kind of correct themselves. And so I think with the scriptures, the numbers that matter are the ones that are 100% accurate, I think. Like, when we look at Jesus, dying and being in the grave. But was he there for, what's 24 times 3? 72?
Right.
So there for 72 hours?
Well, he wasn't.
He wasn't, yeah. So, like, but 3 days. And so there's that type of thing. I definitely think, during the time of Joshua and in the New Testament, like, I mean, you can just see how much that society has just advanced.
Yeah.
And so certain numbers but they're more specific because of the intention or the purpose that they're trying to get across to verify, to have a witness to an event where, learning about numbers, I just think of Lord of the Rings types of stuff. Like, we got thousands of people died in this, in this war. It's like, well, did they? And I know it's Lord of the Rings, but like, it's just that way of this was devastating, or all of the people went and got rescued. And so I think it's very similar, like when there's polls today, and it's like 98% of Americans are like, well, you polled 200 people, so and so the goal there is to just give you an idea of what it's about, or some type of statistic, and not to be specific like you're in the court of law trying to be a witness and validate someone's story.
Which I don't think was the point. And again, I would say there's discrepancy in how you understand the numbers. Like the Joshua specific example. Again, there's probably more to like, well, did they artificially inflate them on purpose? I don't know if there's a correlation between the Jesus 3 days thing, but I think that's a good idea, or a good example of like, we read 3 days and we would assume it would be 72 hours. The first century, they read 3 days and they just meant like 3 separate days. Jesus died on a Friday afternoon, and on Sunday morning he was resurrected.
48 hours for all.
I mean, it was like, it's like it was on 3. So that's how they counted their time.
Yeah.
So.
But I think also like the books of Kings. Like sometimes when there's some Kings and Chronicles, there's some overlap.
Yeah.
And some of the stories, so it's like in one book it says this person reigned for this amount of years. The next one it's different. Well, it's because if they were, rose to power on December the 31st, that's their first year. So the very next day is year 2.
Correct.
So it's just fascinating. That's how it happens. Okay, so moving on here, we've got a couple other more related questions. So I did want to kind of jump down to the second one here, just because you had mentioned it about, is it okay or normal to be offended by the Bible?
Yeah, that's the question. I mean, I would say you should be, and it is okay. It's for me, like studying the Bible over time. There was a time when I hit on this somewhat a little bit yesterday. Like when I first understood like how the Bible was written, it's kind of, I wouldn't say it was a crisis of faith, but it's kind of hard. Like you kind of assume I knew God told me exactly what to write, but then you hear there were the authors, and then there were compilers, and then there were editors. You're like, wait, I thought this was, I would say that God, through his Spirit, can work and all these things, that sort of thing. I'll just say, like, there are a lot of things in the Bible, some of the things that we've just talked about, some other questions we're going to get to in a second, that should be hard. And it should be challenging. I like to put it like this, like, it's easy for us to read the New Testament, Jesus challenging the Pharisees, and we're like, man, they're so stupid, I can't believe. If Jesus were here today, there would be, without a doubt, there are things that he would do that I'd be like, man, I don't know that I agree with that. And my thing is, would I be willing to submit myself and to learn and to question, as opposed to just right away, theoretically throwing stones and dismissing. And so that's, I think when reading the Bible, we should, if you've actually read it, you should have questions and wondering, and like, that's just a very normal thing because we are not God, and it's like, we are not there. We're not sure why he does all the things that he does. So yes, it's very normal.
Well, and even the Apostle Paul, told the different churches that he wrote to, like, be like, I think it was the Berean Christians, like, double check what I'm telling you.
Yeah.
So it's okay to have these questions and these challenges. Like, wow, this feel like, I mean, you look at the Old Testament, like, they're wiping people out. I'm like, that's very uncomfortable.
Yep.
Because we know it's not just men, that are soldiers. So, I think I'm there with you. Okay, so if the Bible is so reliable, this is a great question. Why are so many college professors convinced the Bible is unreliable? And so this individual question came that was their experience when they were in college.
Yeah. I mean, this is my experience. I went to UNCW as an undergrad, was a religious studies major, studied all world religions. Hardly any of them were Christians. A couple of them claimed to be Christians, and then like I was like, this is, what do you, like, why would you claim, you obviously don't believe it. And then I can't judge someone's heart, but there were like 2 of like the 10 or 11 in the philosophy religion department that I would say, man, they genuinely love Jesus and like are following him. Most of them kind of claimed atheism, agnosticism. A couple claimed to be Christians, but then like would say things. And I'm like, that, it was just weird. Anyway, I would say a couple things. One, especially in my experience, like we never would have studied the reliability of the minor details in the miracles. Like the thing we did on the on the 3,500. It's kind of like, obviously this can't happen. This is wrong. And so it's kind of the assumption is like these big things are wrong. We didn't study how people refer to Jesus. And again, it doesn't prove that it happens, but it does prove like these people aren't dumb. And that's kind of the vibe that you get. So I would say part of it is like there are some very significant claims in the Bible, and that if you automatically is assuming those can't happen, then there's no point in continuing further. I would say that. I would also say that following Jesus is not just an intellectual thing. Like if I believe 2 + 2 is 4, you believe 2 + 2 is 5, doesn't matter. Like your life, I mean, you might get some wrong tipping.
I'll get more cookies.
That's right. But like you can live your life.
Yeah.
If you believe that Jesus, the Son of God, rose from the dead, and He is the way, the truth, and the life, that no one comes to the Father except through Him, that changes your life. And are you like willing to like do this? Like it's not just, well, I think this is true or not. Like if this is true,
there are
changes,
implications.
There are tons of implications about our life that like have to be changed. Same thing with like scientists who are or not Christians. Although it's kind of funny, people kind of assume like scientists, no one's Christian. The data, the most recent, if you read the data, the more educated you are, at least in America, the more likely you are to believe not just in God, but to be a Christian. So there's a higher percentage of people who are PhDs that are Christians than people who are high school graduates. So I just think that's funny.
That's fascinating.
Anyway, so like with the scientist thing, it's like it's not just about the empirical evidence. It's about it's going to change your heart, like you change your life. And the third thing is, I was going to look up the passage. I didn't. In the Gospels, Jesus talks about it's the story of Lazarus and the rich man. So not Jesus' friend Lazarus, who he rose from the dead, but it's like the rich man who like treated Lazarus, this poor man, poorly. They both die. Lazarus goes to the good place, and the rich man, who we're not given a name, goes to the bad place. Yeah. And he's begging. He asks for a cup of water, and he asks like if Lazarus can go back to warn his brothers and his family. And God tells, and this is a parable, but still, in the parable, God tells the rich man that if they reject Moses and the prophets, they're not even going to believe Lazarus who goes back to the. And then it talks about like a softness of heart. And I would say the scriptures talk about like being blind and being a hardness of heart and having scales falling off your eyes and a softness of heart. Like part of it is the Spirit of God regenerating us and bringing us from death to life. And like it's not just about intellectual argument. If somebody's heart is hardened to the things of God, like there is no argument that will that's going to like change that. And so we should like study the scriptures, that sort of thing, but we should also pray for our friends, coworkers, whoever, that God would soften their hearts so that they would be open to these things. And a lot of people just aren't, regardless if they're a religious professor or otherwise.
Yep. I think it's really important when I see people who are truly going on like an intellectual pursuit or journey, and then they come to faith, or at least taking baby steps. It's like, okay, there is this God. I don't know if it's a personal God, but it's like, rarely have I seen it go kind of the opposite direction. You know, we think of Lee Strobel, who write all these books. Like he was a journalist who sought out to disprove Christianity, and has now like been one of the biggest advocates for it. You know, and I know that's not the case for everything, but like our biggest prayer is like if there's an intellectual pursuit, you know, we trust that then there's just going to be heart change, you know, through that. And so, yeah. Okay, so speaking of the Bible being confusing, So where would someone start to study? Like, what advice can you give people listening how to just rudimentary understanding of where to begin?
Yeah, so like this person said, the Bible is confusing. So I would say like that's okay. The things about the scriptures is it is ancient language, thousands of years ago, different cultural contexts. Like you have to study it.
Yeah.
The good news is what the Bible is calling us to do, you can understand regardless of how much you know about the ancient culture. That we are sinners, that Christ died for us, that he rose from the dead, what it takes to participate in the kingdom of God. That is very clear, which is the good news. The hard part is like, it's hard and it's confusing. So like, I just want to point out, you don't have to have any sort of degree or anything to read the Gospel of John and see like, oh, I need to follow Jesus. That's good news. But there's like, I mean, you mentioned like the conquest, the stuff in Joshua. There's like a lot of confusing things. Here's what I would say, basic level, join a Bible preaching church. That's not everything, but that is something.
Point of reference, yeah.
I would recommend spending time reading the Bible, 4 to 5 days, at minimum a week, a chapter or two, because the Spirit of God is living and active if you're a follower of Jesus, and things are revealed to you. Now, not everything, but like if you never read it, you can't understand it. And so my question is always like, how much do you actually want to understand the Bible? Like it's easy to say like, hey, I want to learn more, but like how much are you actually willing to learn more? Because if to ultimately learn more, you've got to study it. I like to recommend to people, I think a really easy first step is to get a study Bible. Like the ESV study Bible is a good one, anyone. And like, if you just read a chapter a day and then read the study notes. Now, they're not going to tell you everything, but they're going to be like, they're going to give you some cultural context, the questions, the passages that are very confusing. And that's where I would start, is I would get a study Bible and I'd commit to reading God's word 4 to 5 days every single week. And then like, if you really want to know it more, I mean, you can buy a biblical commentary on a book of the Bible or a theology textbook. Or like you mentioned earlier, I'm a big fan of the Bible Project, and they do a lot of resources, YouTube, that sort of thing. They also do a podcast every single week. I listen to their podcast every single week, and they explain stuff like that. And so, but I would just like read the Bible more and get a study Bible. I think that'd be my first step. Continue to come to a new city and join a community group. I mean, you can go a lot deeper,
Yeah.
but it starts with like interacting with it on a consistent basis.
Yeah, I definitely would say like don't not start because you don't know where to start. And one of the things that really helped me out, there's a series, I think it's the Good Book Company, a publishing company. And they write a bunch of, I think it started like 6 or 7 years ago, called God's Word for You. Timothy Keller had done a couple and some other prominent people. And so it's almost like I want to say a running commentary because that's what a commentary is, but you're reading this passage and then they're just kind of explaining it to you in a very devotional-like way, but also tapping into some of that, some of the scholarly aspects. So it's that nice happy medium. So it's called God's Word for You. They've almost got, I think, every book of the Bible of that with it. And I have used that to give to people who are just kind of starting their faith journey, and it's very, very helpful. And of course, I think the Gospels is always a solid place to start. Some fun narratives, some crazy stories, but yeah.
Yeah, I would say too, again, you could buy those things, or like I said, like a theology textbook. If you really want to like study the Word, here's my biggest recommendation. This is why it's like, how much do you want this? Let's say you're reading the book of John. I would buy a commentary on John. And I'd read John chapter 1, and then I'd read the commentary. And then I'd read John chapter 2, and that's where you could start there. Yep. Commentaries aren't everything, but they do kind of uncover some things that help you start to learn, so that's what you can
Write some questions that might come in, and then maybe you can talk to some other people that you might know or maybe further along in their faith to ask them those questions. But like also, there is no rush. You know, I mean, obviously don't do nothing, but if you are just tackling, if you're like, man, I'm only doing like 3 or 4 verses a day or a week, that is okay. That is okay. So don't feel like you have to keep pace with other people. Okay, so got a litany of questions here. This is great. So why is the Bible in the order that it's in? Who made that call?
Yeah, so I'll do this quick because we got
some these popcorn questions.
So it's helpful to know the Protestant Bible, which is what a lot of us read. The Old Testament is actually in a different order than the Jewish Hebrew Bible. Now, why did they change it? It's like, I don't know why they did. I think it's not helpful. I would just say this. The first 5 books, which is the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, they're the same in both our Bible and the ancient Hebrew Bible. And then it changes. For us, you have I just have this written down here, or I have this pulled up here. You have the prophets. So start with Joshua through Joshua, Judges. No, sorry, this is not let me pull up ours. You have Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, then Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd King. You have kind of like the historical books, and then you have the prophetic books. So you have the law, you have like the history, and then you have the prophetic books. The Hebrew Bible has the law, the first 5 books. Then they start with the prophets, but it's in a different order. So it's Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. Then they do like, okay, so let me take this back. Me reading all these things are going to be very confusing. All I have to say, our order is different, and then we have like the major prophets, and then our order you end with the minor prophets. Now, that just means length. So like Isaiah, Ezekiel, those are major prophets, Obadiah, Nahum, that sort of thing. These are minor prophets. So you have the law, the history, and then the prophets. The ancient Bible is different, and I think it's kind of unfortunate because like in the Hebrew Bible, it actually ends with 2nd Chronicles, which is a historical book. So in ours, it's kind of more towards the first third of the Old Testament. It's interesting is like the end of 2nd Chronicles maps on to Jesus' final words at the end of Matthew. Matthew is written to a Jewish Christian audience, but Jews in particular. And so Jesus' Great Commission actually maps on, and there's no doubt this is on purpose, maps on to King, I forget the king who was the king of Babylon at the time of 2nd Chronicles. And it's like it's kind of like an inversion of what he says. Anyway, there's a couple of things in Matthew where it does that. So I'm not sure why, off the top of my head, I don't remember why they changed it. Well, I do know this. You have the Hebrew Old Testament written in Hebrew. Then you had the Greek Septuagint, which was the translation of Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. And the Greek Septuagint is the order that our Old Testament is in now. Why they changed it, I'm not quite sure they did it, but that's how they did it. The New Testament is you have the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which I think, if I remember correctly, could get this wrong, it's so St. Augustine, church father, 4th century. That was his order because that was the order that he thought they were written in, which is debatable now. But that's just like kind of why. And then you have Acts, which is the early church. And then you have Paul's letters. The order of Paul's letters in the New Testament are just from biggest to smallest. So Romans is his biggest. 1 Corinthians is the second biggest. Now, 2 Corinthians is not his third biggest, but 1st and 2nd go together. Just like 1st, 2nd Timothy, 1st, 2nd Thessalonians. But it's just like his order of the books. And then you have Hebrews. And then you have James, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd John, Jude, and Revelation. And from James to Jude is just the order of length. And then Revelation is the last one. So I wouldn't say there's not necessarily like a special rhyme or reason, but that is the order that we have them now.
Yep. Boy, and then a lot of Paul's letters were written like while he was traveling in Acts. So like they're definitely not chronological.
They're not chronological. Paul's letters in the New Testament, they are in order of length. So.
Why did God save Noah from the flood?
And
why did people live so long in Genesis? I think that kind of be.
Well, so why did God only save Noah from the flood? I just want to read this real quick.
Okay.
Well, I mean, they both go together. I just want to read in Genesis 6. It says this: When the Lord saw that human wickedness was widespread on the earth, and that every inclination of the human mind was nothing but evil all the time, the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth and was deeply grieved. Then the Lord said, I will wipe mankind whom I created off the face of the earth, together with the animals, creatures that crawl, and birds of the sky, for I regret that I made them. Verse 8, Noah, however, found favor with the Lord. And then verse 9, these are the family records of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among his contemporaries. Noah walked with God. Now, there's a couple of Genesis questions here. 2 years ago, I think now, we preached through Genesis. So I don't want to be that guy, like go listen to sermons. But I preached on Genesis 6. So I'll go back in there. Here's what we see. For whatever reason, God gave favor on Noah. But also, Noah was walking with God. My think is, we get really, understandably, with our modern context, questioning and like uncomfortable with like some of the conquests and the things that God did in the Old Testament. I think if there was a way for us to like see a video recording of what things were like in the Old Testament and some of these things that were going on, our problem would not be that God dealt with evil, but that he waited so long. Like some of the child sacrifice, some of the blatant like rape and pillaging and like whatever this widespread wickedness was, like I think if we were able to witness it, we would be like so appalled. And so he was righteous. He was walking with the Lord. Most people weren't. And there's probably more to it. To answer, I don't fully know, but we do know most people were like probably wilding out crazy, like full of evil wickedness, and he wasn't.
Yeah, Noah wasn't perfect, but like compared to stuff, he's like, all right, Noah's a faithful man. Almost like when you look at hopefully your leaders in your church are faithful, and it's like I'm gonna use this guy to let's just
and long story short, you have Adam and Eve, and then Cain and Abel, and it like progressively, like right away, things are getting worse and worse and worse. Cain killed one person, Lamech kills even more people and like brags about it. It's like things are getting downhill really fast. Why people live so long in Genesis, the Old Testament, I don't know. Again, I am persuaded, and I mentioned this in the Genesis series, I am persuaded, it's not like a Christian conviction, it has nothing to do with salvation, that the ages of the people in Genesis are accurate. That they actually lived for hundreds of years, 900 something years with Methuselah. And I'm comfortable with saying I have no idea. There's some stuff with the Nephilim, some crazy things going on. You could say like there is something special and significant about Adam and Eve and their descendants. And then after, the Noah flood, God says about 120 days. And you can argue, like, is that literal? Is that symbolic? Whatever. But something changed after the flood. And I'm not sure. A lot of Christians have different understandings of what that is. If I had to say I am persuaded that they lived so long, you could say maybe there's something special about them that changed after Noah or whatever. But I don't know why, but they did.
One of the views I hear most is because of so much water. Because didn't it say that it never rained or it hadn't rained that much?
Well, some people will say that it never. I mean, it depends on like what you think.
Yeah.
And I don't want to get myself in trouble here.
Well, somehow it changed the environment. Of location.
So personally, again, Genesis 6. Go back to the sermon. I am personally persuaded that it was not a global flood. And so some people will say something in the environment changed. Well, if it's a global flood, that makes sense. If it wasn't an entire global flood, then that wouldn't work.
Yeah.
And so that's why it just depends on a lot of things. And so, again, if you're like, he doesn't believe in a global flood, I believe there was a massive flood, tons of people died, all this sort of thing. But you can go back to Genesis 6 and listen to that sermon if you want to learn more.
There you go.
So no, we don't have a good answer to your question, unfortunately.
It is an answer.
That's right.
All right, so we can't pick and choose what we believe from the Bible. How do we know that the people who wrote it have it like the correct idea, perspective, interpretation?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So we can't pick and choose what we believe, but how do we know that their interpretation is correct? So again, I would say this, and this is like texting and Q&A, so I know it's hard to like ask all the questions. Yeah. The writers weren't interpreting. We are interpreting. They're just writing, led by the Spirit, what happened, what God wanted, that sort of thing. So the question is, how do we know that we have the correct interpretation, not them, because they're not interpreting? And that's the good question. How do we know that our ideas are correct? I would say, again, this is a big question here, understanding and reading the Bible in its totality and its context, understanding it was written not to us, but it was written for us. And so sometimes we assume that it was written to us as like a 2024 American. And if without that understanding, you can assume that certain things are trying to say certain things that it's not trying to say. And so I would say read the Bible a lot, study church, ancient church fathers, like historically what the church has believed. It doesn't mean that like it's 100% true, but that should count for something, like how have we understood this throughout the history of the church. So I would say the people who wrote it, their interpretation, there's not interpretation. They're just wrote what happened. And you probably would have phrased that differently if we were having a conversation, so I want to grant that. But our thing, I would say this way too, there is one correct interpretation, there are many applications. Some people say there are many interpretations. That's not true. Like whatever given passage that you're reading, like there's a right way to understand it and there's many wrong ways. Yeah. However, within that right way to understand it, there might be various applications. So for example, if God is talking about sexual integrity, well, there's a lot of different ways to apply sexual integrity. Yeah. But if it says flee sexual immorality, which in the biblical context is any sort of sexual relationship outside of a man and a woman in a covenanted marriage, then like there are a lot of different applications, but the interpretation is like honor men and women like your brother and sister if you're not married to them. Like that's the correct interpretation, and the application is different. It's not like, well, that's just what you think. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, what does the Bible say? So that's a big question. That's a quick thought.
Genesis 32. Good Genesis questions. Jacob wrestles with God. Was this a physical fight, and how?
So there is an angel that Jacob wrestles with God after like this disagreement. They wrestle all night. And again, if you go to the sermon, if you do CR.com/sermon, you can go to our Genesis series, preached on it. From what I remember, again, I am persuaded that it was a real angel of the Lord, perhaps God. I can't remember if I thought it was God himself or not. Not that it matters. And then they fight and they wrestle. And Jacob like holds his own. I would say he holds his own because God allows him to hold his own. And eventually he taps out. Yeah. Like eventually, it's kind of hard to see in English, but it's like a finishing move, I would say, is kind of the way I phrased it. And then like he has his hip issue. Like, he dislocates his hip and like he limps.
Yep. You're gonna remember this battle, kind of.
Yeah. And it was kind of this like, Jacob had to like allow God, like Jacob was very self-confident, I'm gonna do this thing. It's like, no. Like, he's like, I need you to bless me. It's like submitting to him. As a side note, people will say Jacob limped for the rest of his life. The text doesn't say that. So some people are like, it says he limped right after he fought, but it doesn't say he might have.
I mean, I limp when I get out of bed. So
Yeah.
like,
Not that it matters.
doesn't mean I keep limping.
But I always like to correct that. Some people say things like the Bible doesn't say he had a limp for the rest of his life.
No.
Maybe, but yeah, I would say that it was a physical wrestling that an angel manifested into a body. How does that happen? I don't know, but God can do whatever He wants. And there was a manifestation, and they wrestled. Obviously, Jacob couldn't win, but they wrestled for a long time before Jacob, I think, realized this is not a normal human that I'm wrestling. Bless me, that sort of thing. So.
Judges 2:11 through 15. God gets mad and acts on his anger. And to be honest, like God acts on his anger often, but obviously we'll get to what kind of anger that is. But for him to act on his anger kind of makes him just like us. What is that true?
Oh, come on. Read the whole thing.
What? Oh, that's not great.
That's right. I
That's
love
not
that.
great.
I
Sorry,
love the
sorry.
commentary. I love
Sorry,
that
sorry,
additional
sorry.
commentary.
Sorry.
I just want to.
That's not great.
Yeah. Let me read you Judges 2:11 through 15. The Israelites did what was evil in the Lord's sight. They worshipped, actually in Hebrew you would say Baals, but some says Baals or Baals, but it's like Baals. Anyway, it doesn't matter. They worshipped false gods. Verse 12, and abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed other gods from surrounding peoples and bowed down to them. They angered the Lord, for they abandoned him and worshipped Baal and the Ashtoreths. The Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he handed them over to the marauders who raided them, sold them to the enemies and around them, and they could no longer resist their enemies. Verse 15, whenever the Israelites went out, the Lord was against them. They brought disaster on them, just as he promised, and was sworn to them, so they suffered greatly. Now let me just say this. This is helpful, like understanding and reading the Bible. When it says that the Israelites worship these false gods, the implication here is not just that they worship false gods, which is bad. It also means that they would have participated in the same practices: child sacrifice, temple prostitution, like awful, terrible things. So the book of Judges, the Israelites are in Israel before they have their own monarchy, and they're wilding out, going crazy. Evil, wicked stuff. So God is angry, and it's like kind of makes us like us. I would submit this to you. One thing, I want to read Exodus 34. It's the most quoted passage in the Bible. The Bible quotes this passage more than anywhere else. Exodus 34, God is with Moses on the mountain. It says this. The Lord passed in front of him and proclaimed, because Moses is like, I want to see you. It says this. The Lord is a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger. Literally in the Hebrew means he's long of nose or long of snout. I don't know why that means slow to anger. Right. And abounding in faithful love and truth, maintaining faithful love to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity, rebellion, and sin. So and then it goes on, but he will not leave the guilty unpunished. It goes on. I just want to say this. If God is angry and he is very slow to anger, it means that like it is wicked and bad. So I just want to say like, this isn't like God like snapped. He has been, I think, because we're not God, if we could see what was going on, we'd be like, why are you waiting? I would also say that anger in itself is not bad. We are told in the New Testament, like, it's okay to be angry, but it needs to be righteous, and do not let your anger lead to sin. I would say, like, if you see, this is graphic, but I'll just give an example. Right now, there's a lot of stuff coming out in Europe about some of these Pakistani Muslims who are. There's been like this rape ring in Europe for the last couple decades, and it's like it's all coming exposed. They're like doing these things. It's awful. Okay, awful. And I'm reading the stories, and I'm angry. Like they're raping girls and young boys. Like, is it wrong to be angry at that? No. Like that, there's a righteous anger against wickedness. And that is what God is doing here. Now, how he responds matters. Like if you and I, we can be righteously angry, but we also can have anger that leads us into sin, which is what the New Testament, I think it's in James, tells us not to do. It doesn't say like, never be angry. He says, don't let your anger lead you to sin. Yeah. And so God's anger is a righteous anger against wickedness and evil. And that's what's going on in Judges and many other places in the Old Testament. So.
And I would sum that up. God does not have temper tantrums.
Correct.
He does not. And
his nose is very long.
Yes, his nose is very long. We have very short noses.
Yes.
So yeah, God does not have temper tantrums. Next two questions here I think can be sandwiched together. So if Jesus came and saved everyone once, why can't he come and do it again? So maybe that's what the book of Revelation is referring to.
Or maybe multiple revelations.
Oh, yes.
I don't know.
Okay, yeah. Not sure. But then with that also is with all the bad stuff going on in the world, like where is Jesus? Why doesn't he come and just save everyone like he did?
Yeah, so point of clarification, if Jesus came and saved everyone, why can't he do it again? Jesus never came and saved everyone. So he came to be the savior of the world, to offer himself up to save everyone. And the book of 1st, 2 Peter talks about how God wishes everyone would come to the saving knowledge of his Son. But he never saved everyone. He came to offer that. So again, this is where like the texting is hard.
Yeah.
I just want to clear, he never saved everyone once. He offered himself as the final salvation, and that is offered for everyone for all times. So there's no universal salvation in the in the Bible. So why can't he come and do it again? I would just say, like the book of Hebrews, he was the final sacrifice once and for all time. So his sacrifice on the cross is good forever. And right now he's reigning at the right hand of the Father of God. So he doesn't, and again, I'm not sure this is what they're asking, but all we have to go here. He doesn't need to do it multiple times because it was sufficient. Like his sacrifice was sufficient for all that we need. So that's how I would answer that. I don't know if that.
Yeah. No, I think that. And then,
The bad stuff.
where is Jesus? It's like, I ask that often. Like,
Correct. I want to answer
yeah.
this bad stuff separately. People don't understand this. I think a really great resource, the book Factfulness. It's called Factfulness by Ross. Whatever. If you want to read more about this, you can. And he does a great job. This book came out a couple years ago, but I read it a few months ago. Walking through how people don't, I guess, understand. You may not know this, that our world. I'm not going to take it away from like the evil and sadness happening. Our world is objectively better in virtually every measure than it has ever been. There's less poverty than there's ever been per person. More people percentage-wise have access, even with there being 8-point-something billion people. More people per person, or more percentage of people have access to clean water. More children are vaccinated in the world today. Women are like over about 80% of the countries in the world, women have the same education opportunities as men. There's more access to food, more access to medication. Like, it's actually quite funny that like objectively, from every objective standards, then there's a lot of evil. There's never been a better time to be alive. There is less crime. There's less. Now, here's what we don't realize that because the news, fear sells and focuses on one thing. So like you'll hear about a murder or a kidnapping in America and be like, oh, this is awful. There's like 360 million Americans. Mm-hmm. So like one kidnapping, hear me, is awful. But statistically, it's actually lower. There are less kidnappings right now in America than there's ever been. There's just so many more people, that sort of thing. So I just want to say, like, a lot of people don't know this. And the book Factfulness is helpful because it goes like, and this isn't an opinion, like objective, like all these measures, the world's the best it's ever been. Now, we could debate why that is. Some Christians, based on their eschatology, in other words, how the world's going to end, that's what they think is what happens after Jesus comes. It's going to keep getting better. So all I want to say, it's actually objectively better than it's ever been. I also want to say a lot of bad stuff happens. And to that, it's like, man, I don't have a good answer. Yeah. But I just, like, for those that think like things are getting worse, they're actually getting better. Yeah. It's just that what we hear and see is bad. Not to take away from the bad things that happen. But where is Jesus? He's where he's always been. He's on the throne. And there's a lot of questions that all of us have of why he allows certain things that we do not know. I don't know why he allows certain things this time.
Is there a book in the Bible that talks about Jesus' childhood? What made Jesus Jesus? What has he gone through in his life to bring him to the point of it was death on the cross? But like,
well, yes and no. So I should say not in the Bible. So we have 2 of the 4 Gospels talk about his birth, and then we get one story about him being like 12 years old at the temple, and then the Gospels we don't have anything else. There is the Gospel of Thomas that talks about Jesus' birth. I remember as a kid seeing some like Jesus show on TV, and the Gospel of Thomas it talks about this where Jesus like threw a stone and he killed the bird, but then he healed the bird. And I'm like, well, that doesn't. He still killed him. Like that's not right? That wasn't on purpose or something. I can't remember. I'm going to say this. Go back to yesterday. The 4 Gospels that we have in the New Testament are the only Gospels that can be traced to have been written in the first century. Now, scholars would like to debate this. What's also, I think we got a Bible question here, so I'm not going to get into like scholar stuff yet. But I'll just say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the only Gospels that we would say actually have been written in the first century. I think the Gospel of Thomas is like 150. And if you were with us yesterday talking about like the details, the Gospel of Thomas is like minor details. They're crazy.
Yeah.
The speeches, the things that are attributed to Jesus, like we just know he wouldn't have said. They get the details wrong. They get some names wrong. And it's like, because it was written 100 plus years after the fact in somewhere far away, like that are like in Rome or something like that they try to attribute the first 4 Gospels. And so like, no. In the actual canonical Gospels that actually are legit, we don't have anything as childhood.
Well, and they're not primary sources. When you look at any type of like textual criticism.
I mean, it's clearly like, obviously I'm a Christian, it's clearly like made up stuff far from the event. I mean, it's just obvious, like what is going on here? So I'll say like, we don't know what his childhood was like because we're not told.
I would love to learn one day. Like I mean,
for sure.
I think of him like, dude, this, even as a child, like he is sinless. Like,
as
like, a child, I would like to have.
It's like, what was that like?
I don't know.
I mean, like,
Do you even need to
Well,
parent?
because but it's like the thing is, like you do have to parent because it says he grew in wisdom and stature.
Yeah, and so like, what is?
So he had to learn things, but like he didn't. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's interesting. So how has Jesus felt all our emotions if he never actually gave in to temptation? This is a great question.
Yeah, I would say two things. One, you can feel an emotion and a temptation without giving into it. So Hebrews says that he is like us in every way. He's experienced like everything that we've experienced, been tempted and tried like we are, yet without sin. So I can know what it's like to experience lust, or to have the temptation to sleep with someone who's not my spouse, even though I've never slept with someone who's not my spouse. Like yes, I haven't gone through with it, but it's like we can know what that's like. Now, it doesn't clearly answer. I just want to say, just because he hasn't sinned doesn't mean he doesn't experience it. Mm-hmm. There is a theological word that I don't know what it is off the top of my head. I think there's also, and this is hard for us to think.
I think it's the impeccability of Christ.
I don't know. It
might be the term.
Maybe you can explain it if we're thinking two things.
Yeah, sorry.
I don't know. Say maybe it is. What is that? What is that?
Well, did Jesus have the capacity to sin? He just didn't.
So what I'm thinking is there's a theological term, but basically it's hard for us to wrap our minds around the fact that God has created everything, that He knows everything, that even if Jesus hadn't come on the earth, God, simply by being God, knows. Like He knows what sin, or sorry, He knows what temptation is. He knows in a way that, like, I don't know what it's like to be you, because I'm like, all I know is me.
Yeah.
And like the only way for me to know what it's like to be you is to like somehow be you.
Yeah.
But for God, it's different. He's the creator of all things, that He knows what it's like to be us, even though He's not us. Yeah. There's like a theological concept, I don't know what it's called.
Yeah, okay.
I think that's part of it too, is like,
without being culpable, like he can feel those temptations without being culpable.
Yeah, like He just knows what it's like for us to be us because of who He is, which I know is not a very satisfying answer, but I think it's a legitimate one.
Because there definitely are some, like, for the longest time I struggled personally, that for Jesus to understand what we've been through, like when I'm tempted to something, I'm tempted to sin, which means I have the propensity, I have the ability to fall into that, and that's why it's tempting. And so for the longest time, people have gone back and forth as far as like it's not sin to be tempted, it's just to fall into sin, where others will say, no, it is sinful to be tempted.
And I would say,
like scripturally, there's some issues with
Jesus
that.
was tempted yet without sin. So, great questions. I know some of these questions were probably not super satisfying, and I think that's okay. That's what I'd say.
And we can have different answers and views and still be faithful followers of Christ.
We're getting to the end.
Yes.
For those that are still with us, we got
hopefully the battery will hang on. Since we can't pick and choose what to believe about the Bible, should we take and accept 1 Timothy 2:11 through 15 as well? And what about 1 Corinthians 14?
All right, let me read these real quick.
About women in
1 Timothy 2:11 through 15 says this: A woman is to learn quietly with full submission. I do not allow a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. Instead, she is to remain quiet, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and transgressed. But she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, holiness, and good sense. And then in 1 Corinthians 34:35, it says, As in all the churches of the saints, the women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but are to submit themselves, as the law says. If they want to learn something, then let them ask their own husband at home, since it was disgraceful for a woman to speak in church. So we can't pick and choose. What do we do with that? Great question. This is lots of debate. For the 1 Timothy and even the 1 Corinthians, some people will say there were certain aspects of, like, women weren't very educated in the ancient world. And so they were saying the problem was not that they were women that were speaking, it's that they were uneducated. Now, the problem you have a little bit with that sort of view, and I'm not saying it's an illegitimate view, like there's some historical things we know where some of these churches were going on. The problem is like the Adam and Eve thing, like has nothing to do with that particular culture. I also want to say this. First and 2 Timothy is about authority structure in the church, as well as 1 Corinthians 14. This is not about, and some Christians will apply this to like civil life as well, but Paul here is talking about church authority, not like all in life. So it's not saying women can never speak, can never be leaders. It's saying, at least some interpretations, Paul's just talking about, that's not interpretation, he's just talking about the church. And so when it comes to like pastors, elders, you can see it'd be for man, for women. Now, we also know in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about women praying and prophesying at church. So when it says like be quiet and submissive and not permitted to speak, it can't be that they can't speak in church. Because in this same letter, he talks about them prophesying and praying. What is likely going on here is he's most likely, I would argue, talking about speaking in an authoritative manner, or like preaching the word of God in an authoritative manner. It's not that they can't talk or speak, but it talks about asking questions to your husband at home A, because the men were more educated, and B, again, it's just hard because our culture is so different. Like a sign of disrespect in the ancient world was kind of like talking over your husband in public. Now we can debate, is that right, wrong? I'm just saying in the ancient world, that was a disrespectful thing to do. The Blue Parakeet by Scott McKnight, I'll just tell you, is one that argues for women pastors. And it kind of explains some of the Timothy and 1 Corinthians. What you can't do is ignore it. You have to explain what it is. And so I would say, the long story short is it has to do with authority structures in the church. That's what Paul's talking about. He's not talking about president or whatever. He's just talking about in the church. I think there is something to be said about the education of these women and not being disrespectful. I think there's also something to be said about the order of creation, which he talks about there and some other places. At New City, how we practice it is like, we believe women obviously can speak in church. I mean, like, whatever, do all these things. We have women that lead Bible or community groups, that sort of thing. Our conviction is that the role of the office of elder and pastor is reserved for men, for qualified men, according to the qualifications in 1 and 2 Timothy and some other places. But outside of that, like, anybody can do anything in the church. I think this is more of an authority thing, not saying don't say anything, but speaking with authority and not doing it in a way that's disrespectful in that cultural context.
Yeah, and I don't have anything to add to that, except for like the phrasing of this question. Like, since we can't pick and choose, I want to emphasize that's correct.
Yeah, right.
You know, like
Which is what they're saying.
Yeah, hang
that's
on
great.
to that, and because we can't, there might be some understanding here that maybe this individual has encountered those who are like, all right, this is the one that's relevant today. This one was
Correct.
just the first century. It's like, well, how do we differentiate which is which?
And I just want to say, I know this episode went a lot longer than we thought. In some way, like, I don't want to say like we pick and choose, but in some way we have to decide what is relevant for just the first century and what is relevant for all time. So, for example, it talks about women praying with head coverings, and like, and I think 1 or 2 Corinthians, like, now there are some Christian traditions that they still do that.
Hey.
They like, obviously, New City, we don't, and it's because it's like there's a belief that was relevant for then, but now. So some people in the same way would say some of these things that Paul is talking about, if you understand the context, it was relevant for the first century, but since we live in such a more egalitarian world today, it's different. Now again, it's a lot to debate. All that to say, like Brian was saying, what you were saying, you have to wrestle with it. You can't just ignore it, and there's different ways that Christians over the centuries have come to understand those passages.
Wrestling with it is a good thing to do. You when you study the scriptures and you go to try to apply it to your life, you do not want to take the path of least resistance.
Correct.
Because you will fall into just some unbiblical truths.
And so, and like, if you read 1 Corinthians 14 just by itself, like again, we talk about New City, the Bible's not a handbook that you just read each verse on its own. It's like, and I see this all the time. As in all the churches of the saints, the women should be silent in churches. They are not permitted to speak, but are to submit themselves, as the law says, and keeps going. People say, like, I can't believe. And it's like, this is why you got to read it in the context. You got to wrestle with it. You got to understand. Again, it wasn't written to us. It was written for us. But we are not first century Jewish Christians in that cultural context. So we've got to understand what that means, what the wisdom principles are for our time.
Well, and then you had mentioned before, like there's that Bible study that we kind of talked about earlier,
Yeah.
or the Bible study Bible. There we go. There's notes. There's also cross references. So when you have a passage like this, it's like, well, but there's another passage that, as you talk about, women were prophesying. So you'll let Scripture interpret Scripture, and so that's all a part of studying the Bible. So,
Yeah.
Okay, so we got the last one here. I hear people say that sometimes we need to think about the context of verses in the Bible and not take it literally, since it was a different time, and that makes sense. So where do we draw the line with that? So we kind of started getting into this question. If we take everything in the Bible and say that it was a different time, then doesn't that dilute the true meaning of the Bible and what we use it for?
These last two questions are so good.
Yeah.
Hopefully people that would listen to this listen to the end.
They're honest questions, which
Yeah.
is what we like. Yeah.
So the whole thing about taking the Bible literally, absolutely, we should take, some people will say, we need to think about the context of the verses in the Bible and not take it literally since it was a different time. We should absolutely always take the Bible literally in the same way that the original audience would have understood it.
Yeah.
So when it says that Jesus was in the grave for 3 days, 2024 America, 2025 Western culture, that means something different than the first century. How did the first century understand what that to mean? And that's what it means for us. Again, Genesis, creation in 6 or 7 days. You can debate the word yom and what that means and day, that sort of thing. Like, there is a literal understanding of Genesis that does not require that the earth is 6,000 years old and it happened in 6 literal 24-hour days. You can hold to a literal understanding of Scripture. You just got to understand, like, what is it actually saying? And so what we can get into trouble in is, like, we can just read surface level things and assume that the literal understanding is something that it's actually not. So again, going back to the woman question, because I don't permit a woman to speak in church. What is the literal understanding? If you just read that verse on its own, that women should not talk. As soon as you enter the doors at New City Church this Sunday, if you're a woman, zip your mouth.
Right.
Zip it. Like, that's it. But if that is not, we know for sure that's not how the First Corinthian church understood that. We know for sure. And so, now how exactly did they understand it? We can disagree and debate. But it wasn't women can't talk in church because they prayed and prophesied in church.
Right.
And so I think it goes back to an authority thing, that sort of thing. So it's like, we should take it literally in its proper context. And if you do it in a proper context, then it's okay. It's the problem is like, again, a lot of non-Christians make fun of Christians because they don't understand how to correctly interpret the Bible. And it's like, no, I take it as just as literally as the original readers, to the best of my understanding. Obviously I get things wrong. But how do they understand it? And that's how we should understand it.
Psalms and Proverbs, I don't want to say they're not literal. I mean, how they spoke during the time, the context, and what they were written, they're trying to get across, they're pointing to an actual understanding.
Right.
And so we have to understand what those idioms are, those sayings, sayings that we use every day to convey what we literally are trying to get across. It's just a type of literary thing. You've got the poetry, you've got history, you've got wisdom literature, which we believe, like the Bible as a whole, is wisdom literature, but it's got all these different types of genres.
Like the wisdom books.
Wisdom books, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, to your point, the genre matters. So do we take poetry literally? It's like, well, you know what, if you're reading a poem, like, you know it's trying to convey a meaning or a principle, not like this literally happened. And so if you read it in context, understand the genre, you should understand it, quote unquote, literally as it's meant to be understood.